It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance to escape the monotony of city life. 5 old friends, Sophie, Mark, Liam, Rachel, and Ethan, hadn't seen each other since college. When Sophie inherited a remote cabin in the woods from a distant relative, it seemed like the perfect excuse for a reunion. The group met at a diner just outside the town of Black Hollow, a small, desolate place known for its ghost stories and eerie folklore. The locals eyed them with a mixture of curiosity and concern as they loaded their SUV with supplies. "Are you sure you want to stay up there?" the old cashier asked as Sophie paid for their coffee. "That cabin's been empty for decades." "Sounds perfect," Sophie replied with a laugh, brushing off his warning. The others joined in, their chatter filled with excitement and plans for the weekend. The road to the cabin wound through dense, ancient woods that seemed to close in around them. The further they drove, the weaker their cell signals became. By the time they arrived, their phones were useless. The cabin stood in a clearing, its wooden exterior weathered and dark. It leaned slightly to one side, as if burdened by secrets too heavy to bear. Sophie felt a chill as she unlocked the door with an old brass key, but she shook it off, blaming it on the crisp autumn air. Inside, the cabin was musty but furnished, with cobwebs draped like veils over the furniture. A large stone fireplace dominated the living room, and above it hung a faded portrait of a stern-looking man. "Creepy," Rachel muttered, staring at the painting. "Who's that?" "My great-great-grandfather, I think," Sophie replied. "I never met him." "Lucky you," Liam joked, though his voice was uneasy. As night fell, the group settled in, lighting a fire and sharing stories. The laughter and warmth made the cabin feel less intimidating, but that comfort was short-lived. Somewhere in the woods, a long, mournful wail broke the silence. The friends exchanged nervous glances. "Probably just an animal," Ethan said, though he didn't sound convinced. Hours passed, but the unease lingered. Rachel swore she saw movement outside the window, but when they checked, there was nothing there. As they returned to their seats, Sophie noticed something odd. The portrait above the fireplace, it wasn't just a man anymore. A shadowy figure now loomed behind him, its face obscured but unmistakably present. "Was that there before?" she asked, her voice trembling. The others stared at the painting. None of them could remember. "Let's call it a night," Mark said, trying to lighten the mood. "I'm sure we're all just tired." Reluctantly, they agreed, retreating to their rooms. But sleep didn't come easily. The sounds outside grew louder, more distinct. Whispers, footsteps, laughter that didn't belong to any of them. And in the stillness of the night, Sophie felt something cold and wet touch her hand. When she opened her eyes, there was no one there. The morning light brought a temporary reprieve. The eerie events of the previous night felt distant as the friends gathered in the cabin's small kitchen. Liam had made coffee, and Rachel was flipping through a dusty old journal she found on a bookshelf. "Look at this," Rachel said, setting the journal on the table. "It's ancient. Must have belonged to someone who lived here before." The group leaned in as she turned the pages. The handwriting was spidery and uneven, with entire sections smudged or faded. But the words that remained were enough to send a chill through the room. "The forest watches. The forest listens. But do not speak to the shadows. Do not answer the whispers." "Okay. That's creepy," Mark muttered, taking a step back. "It's just some old superstition," Ethan said, though his voice wavered. "Probably someone who got too caught up in the isolation out here." Sophie closed the journal abruptly. "Let's focus on enjoying the weekend. It's probably just an old story." But as they stepped outside to explore the surrounding woods, the unease from the night before returned. The air was unnaturally still, and the towering trees seemed to lean in, their gnarled branches like claws reaching for the sky. Mark led the way, cracking jokes to lighten the mood. They stumbled upon a stream, its water crystal clear and icy cold. As they knelt to drink, Rachel noticed something on the far bank. A line of small, crudely carved figurines made of twigs and twine. "Who would leave those here?" she asked. "Probably kids playing around," Ethan said, though the figurines didn't look playful. Their forms were twisted, each one missing its eyes. Liam reached out to touch one, but Sophie grabbed his hand. "Don't," she said sharply. She couldn't explain why, but every instinct screamed that they should leave the figurines alone. The tension grew as they trekked deeper into the woods. Strange markings appeared on the trees, slashes and spirals carved deep into the bark. The whispers returned, faint but persistent, riding the wind like an unwelcome melody. They stumbled upon an old well hidden by overgrown vines. Sophie's heart sank as she stared at it, a sense of recognition washing over her. "What's wrong?" Rachel asked. "I've seen this before," Sophie whispered. "In my dreams." The others exchanged uneasy glances, but before they could speak, Liam peered into the well. "It's dry," he said. "Just a hole in the ground." But as he spoke, a sound echoed from the depths. A low, guttural moan that didn't belong to anything human. Liam stumbled back, his face pale. "We should head back," Ethan said, his voice tight. The group hurried to the cabin, but the oppressive atmosphere followed them. By the time they arrived, the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of blood red and gold. Inside, the cabin was colder than it had been that morning, and the shadows seemed darker, more alive. As Sophie went to light the fireplace, she froze. The portrait above the mantel had changed again. The shadowy figure behind her great-great-grandfather was now fully visible, a gaunt woman in a tattered black dress, her hollow eyes staring directly at Sophie. "What is happening here?" Sophie whispered, stepping back. "Whatever it is, we need to leave," Rachel said, her voice shaking. But the moment Rachel spoke, the front door slammed shut, as if the cabin itself had heard her. The group rushed to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The windows, too, were sealed tight. "We're trapped," Ethan muttered, panic rising in his voice. As the night deepened, the whispers grew louder, filling every corner of the cabin. The group huddled in the living room, clutching flashlights and anything that could be used as a weapon. The fireplace crackled weakly, casting flickering light on their terrified faces. And then, at midnight, the whispers stopped. For a brief moment, there was silence. But it was the kind of silence that pressed against their ears, making them painfully aware of their own breathing. Then came the footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from the hallway. "Who's there?" Mark called, his voice trembling. The footsteps stopped, and the group held their breath. But then they heard it, the unmistakable creak of the bedroom door opening upstairs. "We need to stick together," Sophie said, grabbing a poker from the fireplace. The group nodded, their fear giving way to resolve as they made their way upstairs. The hallway was dark, the air thick with the smell of decay. The door to Sophie's room was ajar, swinging slightly on its hinges. They pushed it open cautiously. The room was empty, but the bed was in disarray, as if someone or something had been lying there. On the wall, new words had been scratched into the wood. "The forest watches. The forest listens." But now the shadows are awake. The moment Sophie read the words aloud, the whispers returned, louder, more insistent. And this time they weren't coming from outside. They were coming from inside the cabin. The cabin had become a labyrinth of terror. Every corner was filled with an oppressive darkness, and the whispers had grown so loud they seemed to vibrate in the walls. The group clung to each other as they retreated to the living room, their flashlights shaking in their hands. "We have to get out of here," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "I don't care how. We break a window, we tear the door down. Whatever it takes." Rachel shook her head, her face pale. "It's not just the cabin. Something doesn't want us to leave. Did you feel it when we tried earlier? Like we were being held in place." "Stop talking like that," Mark snapped. "It's just panic. That's all." Before anyone could respond, the lights flickered, and the fire in the hearth sputtered out, plunging the room into near-total darkness. The whispers surged, but now they had form, a language that felt familiar and alien all at once. "Did you hear that?" Sophie whispered. "They're saying our names." A chill ran through the group as the whispers grew more distinct, weaving their names into a dissonant chant. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. Liam clenched the poker in his hand. We need to find where this is coming from and end it. There has to be something in this cabin. Something connected to all this. Sophie hesitated but then nodded. The journal. It mentioned not speaking to the shadows. Maybe it has more clues. They retrieved the journal, gathering around the single flickering flashlight to read its brittle pages. This time, the entries were clearer, as if the words themselves were coming into focus. We thought we could contain it, but the forest's curse cannot be caged. It feeds on fear, on despair. Do not trust the mirrors. Do not trust the voices. Do not stay after the third night. Sophie's stomach dropped. The third night? That's tomorrow. Rachel flipped the page, revealing a crude sketch of the well they had seen earlier in the woods. Around it were symbols, circles within circles, interspersed with jagged lines and spirals. It's the well, she said. That's where it started. Whatever they tried to contain, it's tied to that well. And we were right there, Ethan muttered. We woke it up. A sudden crash shattered their concentration. The group whipped around to see that the portrait above the fireplace had fallen. Its glass shattered. The woman in the tattered dress was gone from the painting. Where did she go? Mark stammered. They didn't have to wait long for an answer. A low, guttural growl echoed from the hallway. Slowly, a shadow began to emerge, twisting and stretching across the floor as if it were alive. It pooled at the edge of the room, blacker than the darkness itself. The group froze as the shadow began to take shape, rising into the unmistakable form of the woman from the painting. Her face was obscured, her movements jerky and unnatural. When she opened her mouth, the whispers exploded into a deafening roar. "Run!" Sophie screamed. The group bolted upstairs, their footsteps thundering on the wooden stairs. They barricaded themselves in Sophie's room, shoving furniture against the door. The whispers didn't abate. They seeped through the walls, growing louder, closer. "What do we do?" Rachel whispered, clutching the journal to her chest. "We go to the well," Sophie said firmly. "Whatever this thing is, that's where it came from. If we're going to stop it, we have to face it." "Are you insane?" Ethan snapped. "You want to go back into the woods with that thing out there?" "If we stay here, it'll kill us," Sophie shot back. "The journal said the third night is the point of no return. If we don't act now, we're done." Liam nodded grimly. "She's right. It's our only chance." The others exchanged frightened glances but eventually agreed. They waited until the whispers receded slightly, then crept downstairs. The shadow woman was gone, but the cabin felt alive, its walls groaning as if breathing. Stepping outside was like breaking through a suffocating barrier. The air was thick and cold, but the whispers were quieter, distant. The group hurried toward the well, flashlights scanning the trees for any sign of movement. When they reached the clearing, the well loomed before them like a gaping wound in the earth. The figurines were gone, replaced by strange symbols carved into the ground around the well. The marks glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Rachel opened the journal, her hands shaking. "There's a ritual. It's meant to seal whatever's in there." "Then let's do it," Mark said, though his voice betrayed his terror. As Rachel read the instructions, the others gathered the required items: stones, twigs, and a knife. The ritual called for a drop of blood from each participant, a price to bind their intent. One by one, they pressed the knife to their palms, letting their blood drip onto the symbols. The wind picked up, carrying the whispers back to them with renewed fury. The trees creaked and groaned as if in protest. Shadows began to gather around the clearing, forming into figures, twisted, incomplete shapes that flickered like dying flames. "Hurry, Rachel!" Sophie yelled. Rachel recited the final words of the ritual, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. The well began to tremble, its depths glowing with an eerie red light. The shadow figures closed in, their movements erratic and hungry. Then, with a deafening roar, the light from the well erupted into the sky, consuming everything in its path. The group screamed as the force knocked them to the ground. For a moment, there was nothing but blinding light and searing heat. And then, silence. When they opened their eyes, the shadows were gone. The well was filled with dirt and stones, as if it had never been opened. The oppressive air had lifted, replaced by an almost peaceful stillness. But as they caught their breath, Sophie noticed something that made her blood run cold. On the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the trees, the shadow woman stood watching. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. "She's still here," Sophie whispered. The group stumbled back to the cabin, their relief at sealing the well quickly overshadowed by the growing unease that their ordeal wasn't over. The shadow woman's silent presence at the edge of the clearing haunted their thoughts. Her eyes, or the lack of them, seemed to bore into their souls, a silent warning that this wasn't the end. The next morning, the woods were unnervingly quiet. Birds chirped faintly, and sunlight filtered through the trees, but the air was heavy with an unnatural stillness. Despite their exhaustion, the group felt no relief, no sense of safety. "I thought closing the well was supposed to fix everything," Ethan muttered, pacing the living room. His voice was sharp, almost accusatory. "We did what the journal said," Rachel snapped back, her own nerves fraying. "I don't know why she's still here." "She's tied to the woods," Sophie said quietly, staring out the window. "I don't think the well was enough. It might have stopped something worse from escaping. But she's not bound by it." Mark slammed his fist on the table. "So what do we do? Sit around and wait for her to kill us?" Liam, who had been silent since the ritual, finally spoke. "We missed something. The journal, it wasn't complete. Some pages were missing, weren't they?" Sophie nodded slowly. "The first few pages were torn out. If there's more to the story, it's not in the journal." Rachel's face went pale. "Then where would it be?" The group reluctantly decided to search the cabin for any clues. They scoured every corner. Dusty cabinets, hidden compartments, loose floorboards, but found nothing. It wasn't until Liam ventured into the basement that he uncovered something chilling. A small wooden chest, buried under piles of old tools and debris. The chest was locked, but Mark used a crowbar to pry it open. Inside was a bundle of papers, yellowed with age. Among them was a letter, written in a frantic, scrawling hand. "To whoever reads this, the well is not the end. The woman is the guardian. She protects the balance. But if her tether is severed, she will seek to claim the living to restore it. Do not let her into your mind. Do not let her speak her name. There is one way to banish her, but the cost is grave. You must return what was taken to its rightful place." "What does that mean?" Rachel whispered, her hands trembling as she held the letter. "Return what was taken?" Ethan repeated. "What could that be?" Sophie frowned, staring at the letter. I think it's talking about the talisman. The one we found near the well. It must belong to her. That thing," Mark said, pulling the small, intricately carved stone talisman from his pocket. "I thought it was just some weird artifact." Rachel's eyes widened. "You kept it? After everything that's happened?" Mark shrugged, though his bravado was shaky. "I thought it might be useful." "Well, congratulations," Sophie said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "You might have just tied us even closer to whatever's happening." The group gathered around the talisman, its surface now glowing faintly with an unsettling light. As they examined it, the whispers returned. Faint at first, then growing louder. But this time they weren't coming from outside the cabin. "They're coming from it," Liam said, pointing at the talisman. Rachel flipped through the newly discovered papers, scanning for anything that could help. "It says here that the talisman binds her to the woods. If we destroyed it—" "No," Sophie interrupted. "The letter said to return it. Destroying it might make things worse." A sudden knock at the door silenced them. It was slow, deliberate, and echoed through the cabin like a death knell. "Don't answer it," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. But the knocking persisted, growing louder and more insistent. The group backed away from the door as shadows began to seep through the cracks, pooling on the floor like liquid darkness. "She's here," Rachel whispered. The talisman in Mark's hand grew hot, burning his palm. He yelped and dropped it, and the glow intensified, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The shadows began to shift and twist, forming the outline of the woman. Her figure was no longer faint. It was fully corporeal, and her hollow gaze fixed on them. "You took what is mine," she rasped, her voice like the creak of ancient wood. The whispers surged, drowning out their thoughts. The group clutched their ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The woman took a step forward, her skeletal hand reaching for the talisman. "Give it to her," Ethan shouted, but Sophie shook her head. "No. If we give it to her here, she'll bind herself to us." "What do we do, then?" Mark yelled, his voice cracking with panic. Sophie's mind raced. "We have to take it back to the well. That's the only place it can be returned." "And how do we get there with her blocking the way?" Liam asked, pointing at the shadow woman, who was now gliding toward them, her movements unnaturally fluid. Sophie grabbed the talisman from the floor, ignoring its searing heat. "We run." Without waiting for a response, she bolted for the back door, the others following close behind. The shadow woman let out a blood-curdling scream and surged after them, her form dissolving into a mass of swirling darkness. The group sprinted through the woods, the talisman's glow lighting their path. The whispers grew louder, merging with the woman's wails. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches clawing at their clothes and skin. "There's the clearing," Sophie shouted, her voice hoarse. They burst into the clearing, their breath ragged. The well was still sealed, but the symbols around it had begun to glow again, as if responding to the talisman's presence. Sophie placed the talisman on the ground and began reciting the words from the letter. The others formed a protective circle around her, their flashlights aimed at the encroaching shadows. The shadow woman materialized at the edge of the clearing, her form writhing and expanding. She let out a deafening roar, and the ground beneath them shook. "Hurry, Sophie!" Rachel cried. The talisman began to pulse, its light growing brighter with each word Sophie spoke. The woman lunged toward them, but an invisible barrier stopped her, the symbols on the ground flaring in defiance. With a final, desperate cry, Sophie finished the incantation. The talisman shattered, and a shockwave of light erupted from the well, enveloping the clearing. The group shielded their eyes as the light consumed the shadow woman. Her screams echoed through the woods, rising to a crescendo before abruptly cutting off. When the light faded, the clearing was silent. The oppressive air was gone, replaced by a serene stillness. The well was now completely sealed, the symbols etched into its surface dark and inert. As the group stumbled back to the cabin, exhausted but alive, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The woods felt too quiet, too still. And when she glanced back at the clearing, she thought she saw a faint figure standing near the well. The shadow woman was gone, but something else had awakened. The group returned to the cabin, their bodies heavy with exhaustion but their minds restless. The talisman was destroyed, the shadow woman vanquished, or so they thought. Yet, Sophie couldn't ignore the faint figure she'd seen lingering near the well, nor the sense that the woods were holding their breath, waiting. The next morning, the air seemed lighter. Birds chirped again, and the oppressive silence of the forest was gone. Ethan cooked a meager breakfast while Mark repaired the front door, which had been splintered by their frantic escape the night before. "It's over," Mark said confidently, nailing the last board into place. "We did it." Sophie, sitting by the window, shook her head. "I don't think it's over. I saw something last night, near the well." Rachel groaned. "Sophie, come on. We destroyed the talisman. We did the ritual. What else could there be?" Liam, who had been quiet since their return, finally spoke. "The letter said the cost would be grave. What if that part hasn't happened yet?" The group fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. The cabin felt too small, too suffocating. The whispers were gone, but something deeper, more insidious, lingered. She slipped out of bed and went to the window, her breath fogging the glass. The woods seemed normal, almost peaceful, but she knew better. A faint sound reached her ears, a soft, rhythmic knocking. It was coming from the direction of the well. Sophie's heart raced as she grabbed a flashlight and crept outside. The others stirred and followed her, their fear overridden by the need for answers. Together, they trudged through the dark woods, the beam of Sophie's flashlight cutting through the night. As they approached the clearing, the knocking grew louder, resonating like a heartbeat. The well stood in the center, its surface undisturbed. But the ground around it had cracked, and faint tendrils of mist seeped through. "What's happening?" Rachel whispered, clutching Liam's arm. The group circled the well, dread pooling in their stomachs. Suddenly, the mist coalesced into a figure. A woman, but not the shadowy specter they had faced before. This figure was translucent, her features delicate and mournful. "She's different," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "Is she the same one?" The woman's lips moved, but no sound came out. Sophie stepped closer, her instincts screaming at her to stop, but curiosity pulling her forward. "She's trying to tell us something," Sophie said, straining to understand. The woman pointed to the well, then at the group, and finally at the woods beyond. "What does she want?" Mark asked, his hand tightening on the flashlight. Rachel flipped through the journal they had found, scanning the pages for any clue. "Wait. There's something here," she read aloud. "The guardian binds the balance, but her pain anchors the darkness. To break the cycle, the living must choose. A sacrifice must be made to restore peace." "A sacrifice?" Ethan said, his voice rising. "What kind of sacrifice?" The woman pointed at Sophie, her translucent hand passing through the air like smoke. Her gesture was clear. Sophie was the one. "No," Mark said, stepping between Sophie and the figure. "There has to be another way." But Sophie, her face pale and resolute, shook her head. "It's me. I felt it all along. The woods want me." The group argued, desperate to find another solution. But the whispers returned, faint and menacing. The woods seemed to close in around them, urging them toward a decision. "I'll do it," Sophie said, her voice steady. "If it means ending this, I'll do it." "No," Rachel cried, grabbing her arm. "We can figure something else out. Please." Sophie gently pried Rachel's hand away. "It's the only way. You all have to live. This is my choice." She stepped toward the well, the woman's figure watching her with solemn eyes. The ground beneath them rumbled as Sophie approached, the cracks widening. She placed her hand on the edge of the well, the stone cold and unyielding. "What do I do?" she asked the woman. The translucent figure raised her hand and placed it over Sophie's heart. A wave of warmth and sorrow washed over her, and Sophie understood. She had to let go completely. Sophie turned to her friends, tears streaming down her face. "Promise me you'll get out of here. Go back to the world. Live." "No," Mark said, his voice breaking. "Sophie, please. Promise me," she insisted. Reluctantly, they nodded, their faces etched with grief. Sophie took a deep breath and leaned over the well. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her like a chorus. With a final glance at her friends, she closed her eyes and let herself fall. The moment she disappeared, the ground stopped shaking. The mist dissolved, and the cracks sealed themselves. The woman's figure lingered for a moment, her expression one of gratitude, before fading into the night. The woods were silent once more. The group stumbled back to the cabin, their hearts heavy with loss. The oppressive air was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. They packed their belongings and left the woods, vowing never to return. Months later, back in the city, Rachel sat alone in her apartment, staring at a photograph of the group. Sophie's absence was a gaping hole in their lives, but they knew her sacrifice had saved them. One night, as Rachel prepared for bed, she heard a faint whisper. She froze, her heart pounding. When she turned, she saw a figure standing in the corner of her room, a translucent woman with a sad smile. It was Sophie. "Thank you," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. And then she was gone. The woods might have been silent, but their story would haunt them forever.